Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Annual. Scott and I go ways back. His family still goes to church about a half hour north of where I'm sitting, and but it wasn't really geography that brought us together, but ideology and a concern for the state of worship in the Christian church, which has evolved considerably over the years, and that's the topic for discussion this morning. Hopefully, you will all get either have or will get a copy of this pre-pub version of the article. It'll have some more of the documentation that you need to fill it out, and a few other comments along the way. You can see the title here is on the decline of what I call unmodified psalmody. In the English tradition, I'll explain what I mean by that. And I am concluding that it's a question of hermeneutics and ecclesiastical mission that have changed over the course of decades and centuries. So I start out with introduction here, that examining the indices of historical English songbooks used for worship is an enlightening exercise. You're overwhelmed, especially in the oldest of these, by the preference for and sometimes exclusivity of the Psalms and other inspired material. Secondly, by the prominence of the themes of lament and the crucible of experience, both in inspired and non-inspired hymnody. The Christian gospel, it's not absent in older hymnals, but it's not dominant either. The theme of divine providence takes pride of place, and evangelical truth, gospel truth, needs to be inferred. This presentation explores historical reasons why these things have faded from English hymnody. Its conclusion is that the decline of unmodified psalms, that is not updated for contemporary usage, and with this, the decline of lament and the themes of providence, the corresponding uptick in evangelical psalmody, original hymnody, and more buoyant lyrical themes stem from some hermeneutical and missional developments with respect to gathered worship, and some of these are troubling. That the Hebrew Psalms are mandatory of Christian worship can't credibly be denied. It's pretty plain in Colossians and Ephesians that we're to sing psalms. Church cannot obey God without singing them. Nor do we find any express reason in the scriptures to exclude any of the Psalms. They're all appropriate to Christian worship. Of course, some of these need to be updated in some senses. The affections of longing engendered by forward-looking Psalms may evoke today affections of relief or delight, the fact that they've been fulfilled. Psalms of confidence can become more emphatic as elements of faith become sight, and outmoded cultic elements and cultural elements can invite analogical application. So, for instance, we find our modern trials embodied in David's wilderness experiences. But all in all, the Old Testament Psalms remain incredibly timeless as they stand written, which is a fact emphatically reinforced in the hymnody of early church history. The Hebrew Psalms are as much the property of contemporary Christians as they were of the ancient Israelite. The reason this is true, it seems, is that the general experience of faith, that is new life, conversion, justification, sanctification, assurance, hope of resurrection, is identical for both the Old Testament and New Testament faith communities. Now, the expression of these two communities in terms of their faith has some differences, but the essence of their faith, the object, the crucible of their faith, and the hopeful end of their faith was the same, and for this reason, the songs resonate with us. So the ancient people have songs that resonate with the modern scene. The progress of Revelation, and especially of Christ's historical accomplishments, suggest perhaps that there's abundant material that should lead to additional songs for the present age. And it's possible that the New Testament anticipated this, using poetic devices to introduce original hymnody. Some suggest that Paul's allowance not only for psalms, but also for hymns and spiritual songs anticipates original hymnody as well. Although your professor has an article on the psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, which I think is very helpful. Tendency is to say, what are hymns and spiritual songs? Well, it's whatever I like, of course, and that's probably a bad way of reading your scriptures. The relative paucity of original hymns in the early centuries of the church suggests that caution was the order of the day. The early church used primarily psalms and other inspired material in gathered worship. Let's start here with the Reformation, and skipping a lot of material, obviously, here, but after the medieval period, in which choral music was dominant and really displaced congregational singing, the latter was revived as a result of the Reformation. And with this revival, a trend towards caution. Uneven, as we're going to see, but still a trend towards caution. Luther, being a proponent of the normative principle, allowed and even composed original hymns, but his creativity was tempered, and his compositions were rarely divorced entirely from inspired material. Sometimes you would miss the fact that his most famous song, "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," draws from Psalm 46. John Calvin was more severe, but never properly forbade the practice of original hymn writing, and is even credited with at least one original hymn of his own, but it's actually somewhat doubtful. I tell the story of that in your footnotes. While his earliest edition of the Genevan Psalter, prepared under, I wonder if that's me being feedback here. Let me reduce my volume. While the 1539 edition of the Genevan Psalter, prepared under his direction, contained only psalms and other biblical songs, later editions contained several original hymns. So Calvin is not an exclusive psalmodist, but he's very cautious, very cautious. And his successors took his principle to extremes and adopted exclusive psalmody as the most defensible way of implementing the regulative principle of worship. By the 1560s, several English psalters had emerged. There's a migration of Reformation principles into Puritan worship, and several English psalters begin to emerge, none more revered than the Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter of 1562, sometimes still called the Old Psalter, often published together with the Book of Common Prayer in a single volume. This volume was marked by hermeneutical strictness, and this became a defining hallmark of early 17th century psalters, including, among others, the Scottish Psalter and the Bay Psalm Book, which is the first book that was published in the Americas. John Cotton, in his preface to the latter, is very instructive. He admits that the psalm settings found in these early psalm books, these very strict song books, are not always so smooth and elegant as some may desire or expect, but he defends this shortcoming on the principle that, quote, God's altar needs not our polishings, for we have respected rather a plain translation than to smooth our verses with the sweetness of any paraphrase, and so have a tendon conscience rather than elegance, fidelity rather than poetry, in translating the Hebrew words into English language and David's poetry into English meter. By the time 1647 rolls around, the Westminster Assembly approved with its confession the Directory for Public Worship of God, which replaced the Book of Common Prayer in the churches represented by that assembly for many Puritans. In it, the Westminster divines offered some practical parameters for the singing of psalms in General Assembly. It is the duty of Christians, they write, to praise God publicly by singing of psalms together in the congregation and also privately in the family. In singing of psalms, the voice is to be tunably and gravely ordered, but the chief care must be to sing with understanding and with grace in the heart, making melody unto the Lord. That the whole congregation may join herein, every one that can read is to have a psalm book, and all others not disabled by age or otherwise are to be exhorted to learn to read. But for the present, where many in the congregation cannot read, it is convenient that the minister or some other fit person appointed by him and the other ruling officers do read the psalm line by line before the singing of it. The Directory made no allowance for singing anything other than the psalms, and offered two key recommendations that we just read about. First, that the music be gravely ordered, and that unfamiliar psalms be introduced to the congregations by lining them out, and neither of these ideas was wholly embraced. Not only did the insistence on gravity of mood not set well, some churches read this not so much as a call for sobriety, but for a call of morbidity or just boringness. And also, this experiment with lining out was often implemented poorly. People just weren't able to sing well enough to do that. These factors proved a catalyst for much discontent and reform, and by 1696, a new psalter, more vernacular and graceful in the ear, was published by Nahum Tate and Nicholas Brady, called the New Version of the Psalms of David, fitted to the tunes used in the churches, sometimes called the New Psalter. But dissatisfaction with the old Psalter ran deeper than mere style and mood. By the time the next two reprintings of this new Psalter emerged, a supplement of hymns was added, the first fruits of what Robin Lever calls the hymn explosion. In 1701, in fact, a supplementary volume of hymns was added even to the old Psalter, which would have been unthinkable decades earlier. This trend, observed in the new Psalter and its supplement, did not occur in a vacuum. Broad acceleration away from older and especially exclusive practice of psalmody was swift. The influences towards this change were legion, but two stand out. One is the criticism of exclusive psalmody among English dissenters, among which the Baptists are numbered, leading to revision both in the interpretation of and function of the Psalms for gathered worship. And then secondly, the rise of evangelicalism within the English-speaking world, including with it a suspicion of formalism, fervent pietism, and evangelical missionism. We want to look at that. Let's start with the Baptist dissent and its contribution to the acceptance of original hymnody. The genesis of English original hymnody is almost impossible to trace. Folk hymns extend well back into the medieval period, and these were often preserved orally, which is to say they weren't preserved at all. Early notables in the modern era include George Wither and George Herbert, but neither composed hymns that were used, at least in their day, for congregational singing. Most of these were choral numbers. John Austin, John Playford, and John Mason prepared hymnals in the 1660s, 70s, and 80s, respectively, but these were critically received and only rarely used in public worship and just regionally. But a major breakthrough in popularizing original hymns for use by English congregations came at the hands of the early Baptist minister Benjamin Keach. Keach began composing hymns as early as 1673, possibly earlier, but that's the first one we have dated. And slowly he introduced them in his church, usually at first conjoined with the ordinances. These, of course, are very important to Baptist life, and it distinguishes them from other denominations, and you can't find them in the Hebrew Bible. So he introduced original hymns for the purpose of worship, and specifically the ordinances. In 1689, Keach asked that the group that produced the Second London Baptist Confession make some modifications and accommodations of the practice of original hymnody when they put together that venerable confession. The Baptist Confession, which preserved verbatim large swaths of the Westminster Confession of Faith, expressly modified the Westminster Confession and its injunction for congregations to engage strictly in the singing of psalms. It expanded it here to what is still biblical, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing with grace in our hearts to the Lord. So an expansion here of the fodder for the Baptist liturgy. In 1691, Keach published an extended defense of original hymnody, which he called The Breach Repaired in God's Worship, or Singing of Psalms, Hymns, and Spiritual Songs. proved to be an holy ordinance of Jesus Christ, which was a definitive treatment that paved the way not only for the publication of his own hymnal, but of others as well, notably one by Richard Baxter, another independent, not a Baptist per se, but an independent. It must be stressed that Keach continued to privilege the Psalms in public worship. He did not engage like Watts does later, and we're going to see here, in denigrating, rewriting, and omitting certain Psalms from New Testament worships. In fact, many Baptists did not move away from exclusive psalmody. John Gill, for instance, maintained the practice of exclusive psalmody. However, Keach represents a significant hole in the dike of exclusive psalmody in the English Calvinist tradition. The controversy that ensued was widespread and heated, especially within the community of the dissenting church, but eventually beyond it. Over the course of about 20 years, there were several competing essays on the topic exchanged, and it crested with a rather civil Friday lecture series in Eastcheap, took place in 1708, which was sponsored by a mixed group of Presbyterians and Independents, and it was a very influential meeting that effectually conceded that her original hymnody was here to stay, and so they charted a course for cautiously and including and regulating hymns rather than continuing to resist them. And it was in the middle of this extended controversy, instigated significantly by Keach, that Isaac Watts's philosophy of hymnody was incubated. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit here about radical Reformed influences on psalmody as well on the continent. While the German practice of original hymnody began centuries before the Reformation, John Huss and Thomas Münster are often identified as the earliest to publish vernacular hymn collections, and they rank among the primary influences on Luther to do the same thing. The same impulse, it seems, that encouraged vernacular Bible translation among these pre-reformers also encouraged vernacular hymnody. That is, hymnody that borrowed not only the distinctive tunes of the German people, but also original lyrics. The popularity of German original hymnody expanded with its approval, or cautious approval, at the hand of Luther, but rapidly accelerated beyond the continent in the early 18th century through the Pietist movement, which in 1704 produced its own hymnal, edited by Johann Frühlinghausen at the behest of his uncle, August Hermann Francke, a leading light in the Pietist movement. The world was introduced to Pietist hymnody through the missionary efforts of the Herrnhuter Brüder under the guidance and considerable financial backing of Nicholas Ludwig Reichstraff von Zinzendorf. The primitive influence of Zinzendorf's parents towards Pietism was very influential in Zinzendorf's youth, and as a lad of deep feeling, he began writing poems to Jesus as early as age 6, and many of these were set to tunes. As he grew into young adulthood, Zinzendorf, moved by the terrible suffering that many of his sectarian brothers were enduring at the hands of Reformed and Romanist magistrates, established at Herrnhut a brotherhood, sometimes called the Unitas Fratrum, later called the Moravian Church, where he welcomed Bohemians, Hussites, Moravians, Schwenkfelders, and other disenfranchised Protestant sectarians. And he invited these to recuperate there at the Herrnhut, but not to remain there. Instead, he encouraged them and financed them to disperse throughout Europe and effect revivals of true religion among the impious in churches and throughout the world to seek conversions among the heathen. And to that end, he supplied not only financial backing, but also literature. He had a printing press, and it ran pretty much 24 hours a day. And he published not only Bibles and tracts, but also hymnals. This was a major initiative that he had. Herein, I say, lie the truest roots of the evangelical movement, which is a movement marked from the beginning by evangelical hymnody. That is, hymnody that's designed to promote and to compel faith in the Christian gospel. They were designed that is to complement gospel preaching in churches and to the unconverted. This was a novel function of music in the gathered church, and one, of course, that would have been absent in the Hebrew Psalter. The most famous effect of Moravian piety and evangelistic hymnody in the English world was that influenced on John Wesley, whose 1736 spiritual awakening and eventual conversion occurred under Moravian influence, especially their piety and song. John determined to bring his experience to the whole English-speaking world, and with the help of his brothers, chiefly Charles, eventually succeeded. Now, he actually had one brother, Samuel, who was quite opposed to original hymnody, which you'll see there in the footnote. But John and Charles were big into original hymns. So they developed hymns as creeds of witness to the world. Notice the purpose of these songs. Wesleyan hymnody began modestly, but eventually rode four waves of evangelical awakening in England and in the Americas to a place of prominence. John Wesley did not discount the use of psalms. In fact, he published some of his own adaptations. But he wrote psalms in the habit of Isaac Watts, which we're about to get to here, incurring the wrath of many of his own tradition, including that of his own brother Samuel. But like Watts, Wesley's musical fame, such as it is, rests almost entirely on the original hymns that he wrote. So let's move then to Isaac Watts, whom we are going to conclude is actually the assassin of English hymnody here. That's not my word, I'm borrowing it, as we're going to see. He makes severe modifications to the Psalms. I say no figure looms larger in challenging the Reformed consensus on psalmody than Isaac Watts. Isaac Watts's innovation was threefold. Firstly, he improved English poetry of the standard psalms of the day at the expense, some would argue, of their clarity, but he made them more musical. Secondly, he updated the Psalms in light of the New Testament scriptures, and especially of the work of Christ, his first advent. And then defended the composition of original, uninspired hymns, of which he wrote hundreds. A story from the youth of Watts offers an early glimpse into Watts's philosophy of church hymnody. While still living with his parents, so in the late 17th century, Isaac ostensibly complained to his father about the terrible state of the song that they used in worship at their Southampton church. His father rebuked him and challenged young Isaac to do better, and so he did. So he wrote an original hymn of his own, "Behold the Glories of the Lamb," based loosely on Revelation 5. After this, his rebellion was not met with rebuke, but with praise, and so he was encouraged and emboldened to write many more such hymns. And in very short order, he had written over 200, and he published them in 1707 in a volume titled Hymns and Spiritual Songs. The very first hymn in this collection is "Behold the Glories of the Lamb," which is the first hymn apparently that he wrote. Watts's tensions with the Psalms of his day ran far deeper, however, than merely bad poetry and bad presentation. His concern was also hermeneutical. He believed that the Psalms were written for another dispensation and that they were thus of limited value for the New Testament believer. I have a footnote there that talks about Watts's relationship with dispensationalism as a movement. He really predates it and probably cannot be called legitimately a dispensationalist. And yet some of the ideas start to surface in Watts here. So in the preface to his Hymns and Spiritual Songs, Watts wrote the following. No extended quote here, of course. The gospel, he says, brings us nearer to the heavenly state than all the former dispensations of God among men. And in these last days of the gospel, we are brought almost within sight of the kingdom of our Lord, yet we are very much unacquainted with the songs of the New Jerusalem and unpracticed in the work of praise. To see the dull indifference, the negligent and thoughtless air that sits upon the faces of the whole assembly, while the psalms psalm is on their lips might tempt even a charitable observer to suspect the fervency of inward religion. Of all our religious solemnities, psalmody is the most unhappily managed. That very action which should elevate us to the most delightful and divine sensations doth not only flatten our devotion, but too often wakens our regret and touches all the springs of uneasiness within us. I have been long convinced that one great occasion of this evil arises from the matter and words to which we confine all our songs, the Psalms. Some of them are almost opposite the spirit of the gospel. Many of them are foreign to the state of the New Testament and widely different from the present circumstances of Christians. Hence it comes to pass that when spiritual affections are excited within us and our souls are raised a little above this earth, in the beginning of a psalm, we are checked of a sudden in our ascent toward heaven by some expression which is most suitable to the days of carnal ordinances and fit only to be sung in the worldly sanctuary. When we are just entering into an evangelic frame by some of the glories of the gospel presented by the brightest figures of Judaism, yet in the very next line, perhaps which the clerk parcels out to us, have something in it so extremely Jewish and cloudy that darkens our sight of God the Savior. Thus, by keeping too close to David in the house of God, the veil of Moses is thrown over our hearts. While we are kindling into divine love by the meditations of the loving kindness of God and the multitude of his tender mercies, within a few verses, some dreadful curse against men is proposed to our lips, that God would add iniquity unto their iniquity, nor let them come into his righteousness, but blot them out of the book of the living, which is so contrary to the new commandment of loving our enemies. And even under the Old Testament is best accounted for by referring it to the spirit of prophetic vengeance. Some sentences of the psalmist that are expressive of the temper of our own hearts and the circumstances of our lives may compose our spirits to seriousness and allure us to sweet retirement within ourselves. But we met with a following line, which is so peculiarly belongs to one action or hour of the life of David or Asaph, that breaks off our song in the midst, and our consciences are affrighted, lest we should speak a falsehood unto God. Thus the powers of our soul are shocked of a sudden, and our spirits ruffled before we have time to reflect that this may be sung only as a history of ancient saints, and perhaps in some instances that salvo is scarcely sufficient neither. Besides, it almost always spoils the devotion by breaking the uniform thread from it. For while our lips and our hearts run on sweetly together, applying the words to our own case, there is something of divine delight in it. But once we are forced to turn off the application abruptly, and our lips speak nothing but the heart of David, thus our own hearts are, as it were, forbid the pursuit of the song, and then the harmony and worship grow dull of mere necessity. Many ministers and many private Christians have long groaned under this inconvenience, and have wished rather than attempted a reformation. At their importunate and repeated requests, I have for some years past devoted many hours of leisure to this service. Far be it from my thoughts to lay aside the book of Psalms in public worship entirely. Few can pretend so great a value for them as myself. It is the most noble, most devotional, and divine collection of poesy, and nothing can be supposed more proper to raise a pious soul to heaven than some parts of that book. Never was a piece of experimental divinity so nobly written, so justly reverenced and admired, but it must be acknowledged still that there are 1,000 lines in it, which were not made for a church in our day to assume as his own. So let's sort of summarize here what some of his concerns are. First, Watts doubted that all the Psalms are divine, but rather he thought they contained many words of strictly human origin, nothing but the heart of David or Asaph, he says, and were not appropriate to worship even in the Old Testament, much less the New Testament. Second, Watts asserted that some of the material expressed in the Psalms is opposite the spirit of the gospel, and that the faith expressions of the Old Testament saint reflected in the Psalms were carnal and worldly. Note that Watts views the Old Testament liturgical expressions not merely as antiquated, he calls them worldly and carnal, suggesting that theirs was an experience of law alone, devoid of the grace of gospel. Thirdly, Watts suggests that many of the sentiments expressed in the Hebrew Psalms were contrary to the new commandment of loving our enemies and a falsehood unto God. Watts approved of joyful psalms about God's mercies and loving kindness, but forbade all imprecations, the repeating of divine curses, as unrighteous and vengeful. Can't use the imprecatory psalms in modern worship. Fourthly, and summarily, Watts casts aspersions on a substantial percentage of the Hebrew Psalms. Only parts of that corpus can be salvaged. Indeed, among the 2,461 verses in the Psalms, Watts found 1,000 lines. I'll do the math here, 40% of them, which were not made for the church in our day to assume as his own. So it's little wonder then the church became affrighted to sing them. Watts created something of a stopgap measure that some of the Psalms could be recovered by means of paraphrase. Their dark expressions could be enlightened, the Levitical ceremonies and Hebrew forms of speech changed into the worship of the gospel and explained in the language of our time and nation, and what could not bear such an alteration would be omitted and laid aside. After this manner, should I rejoice to see a good part of the book of Psalms fitted for the use of our churches, and David converted into a Christian. But again, only a good part of the Psalms could be salvaged. A greater part, apparently, could be used than could be used before, but much of it has to be discarded. Watts also included an extended appendix to his hymns and spiritual songs entitled A Short Essay Towards the Improvement of Psalmody, or an enquiry in how the Psalms of David ought to be translated into Christian songs and how lawful and necessary it is to compose other hymns according to the clearer revelations of the gospel for the use of Christian churches. This essay, together with all of the Psalms, was removed from all subsequent printings of the hymns and spiritual songs, and then in 1719 published as a separate work here, the Psalms of David, imitated in the language of the New Testament and applied to the Christian state and worship. The title says it all. In these essays, Watts doubles down on the principles outlined above, calling for the admission of worldly and carnal elements in the Psalms and identifying whole Psalms that should not be accommodated to our times. He further, and I'm going to continue my enumeration here, fifthly, rejected the hermeneutical principle of originalism and said instead that the Psalms ought to be translated in a manner as we have reason to believe David would have composed them had he lived in our day. Okay, talk about originalism with the Constitution, right? We read what it says and apply what it says rather than extrapolating what they might have said in the present day. Okay, so he's calling for an abandonment of originalism in the reading of the Psalms. He also suggested that Judah and Israel could be called England and Scotland, and that the land of Canaan might be translated into Great Britain. Sixthly, Watts added a new and troubling hermeneutical feature, calling for a greater incidence of joy, praise, and thanksgiving in contemporary song than can be found in the Psalms, criticizing the Old Testament penchant for lament as a relic of a time when saints were kept in hard bondage and had not half so much occasion for praise. So get rid of the lament there. That's old, it's archaic, that's from the dispensation of law and should not be part of modern worship. But his greater concern was that the Psalms, seventhly, needed to be Christianized, that is, subjected to an extreme Christological hermeneutic and omitted and laid aside all that cannot bear such alteration. So anything that you can't find Christological elements there need to be discarded. To this end, Watts appealed repeatedly to Psalm 2 as his prime example. Notice how he adapted this psalm. In fact, if you want to sort of grab your Bible there and read Psalm 2 along with it, you can sort of see what he's doing in terms of modifying here. So why did the Jews proclaim their rage? The Romans why their swords employ? Against the Lord their powers engage, his dear anointed to destroy. Come, let us break his bands, they say. This man shall never give us laws. And thus they cast his yoke away and nailed the monarch to the cross. But God, who high in glory reigns, laughs at their pride, their rage controls. He'll vex their hearts with inward pain and speak in thunder to their souls. I will maintain the king I made on Zion's everlasting hill. My hand shall bring him from the dead, and he shall stand your Savior still. His wondrous rising from the earth makes his eternal Godhead known. The Lord declares his heavenly birth. This day I have begot my son. Ascend, my son, to my right hand. There thou shalt ask, and I bestow the utmost bounds of heathen lands. To thee the northern isles shall bow. So we get a good illustration here from this psalm of Watt's plan to Christianize the Psalms, which he does with a great number of them. Watts applied this psalm strictly to Jesus Christ, stripping it of all possible application to the Davidic generally, much less to the experiences of the broader community of faith. The psalm ceased to be a celebration of God's sovereignty and providence in the world at large and reduced to a single act of God's sovereign will, namely the crucifixion and resurrection of our Lord Christ. Watts also supplied a provincial and contextual translation of the Psalms. The nations, reduced to Rome, never mind the plural. The peoples, rather improbably, are Israel. The anointed one is strictly Jesus. And most Hebrew scholars would suggest that this is a coronation psalm that would have been sung for all of the Judahite kings. And so the ends of the earth are translated as the Northern Isles. It's an archipelago of islands just north of Scotland, which sort of created the northern perimeter of Great Britain. In Moyer's words, Watts effectively weaned the church off of the Psalms by over-contextualizing them, causing the people of God to believe that the Psalms in their original form were irrelevant to the New Testament church. In view of these adjustments, the Psalms lost, in a single generation, their place in the church as a comprehensive manual for appropriate redress of God, much less Calvin's anatomy of all the parts of the soul. The Psalms reduced to a prophetic testimony to a particular act of God, the redemptive work of Christ, and lost all of their rich value in demonstrating the general ways of God, his providence. In view of this emasculation of the Psalms, it's no surprise that the church suddenly developed an overwhelming appetite for something else. Isaac Watts had plundered the Psalms and had left miserable Christians with nothing to sing. And in Lever's words, while Watts is rightly regarded as the father of the English hymn, he can also be seen as the assassin of the English metrical psalm. So I've got a mixed view of Watts here. I quite frankly, I consider him one of the, if not the greatest hymnists of all time. I love his hymns. At the same time, he sort of created a market for his hymns by destroying the singing of psalmody in English liturgy. My conclusion then: the reasons for the decline of psalmody in general and lament specifically in congregational worship are manifold, but they are determinate. The initial impetus was reactionary, a response to bad poetry, strict hermeneutics, and overly grave style. But this reaction was a facade for other concerns. Chief among them was a hermeneutical, theological concern that the Hebrew Psalms were neither written for the church nor suitable for the church. Written in the dispensation of law, the Psalms were much too Jewish, too miserable, and too lacking in gospel themes to offer suitable fare for the New Testament church. Some of the Psalms could be updated, not all of them. Some of them were fit only for the dustbin. Prevailing hermeneutical methods employed to update the Psalms also reduced their general value. Extreme contextualization rendered the Psalms suitable only for British exceptionalism. Christocentrism fixated unnaturally on the messianic implications of the Psalms at the expense of their general value to the life of faith lived in the shadow of divine providence. I say also that the rise of the evangelical movement sealed the fate of the Psalms and especially of lament, as the function of the gathered church migrated from communal catechesis, renewal, and assurance 2, evangelistic urgency. The music shifted with it. Evangelical preachers needed music better suited than the metrical psalms to their fervid style, an evangelistic style of preaching. The content of their song increasingly focused on the gospel and its distant hope, rather than developing the sundry and complex implications of the gospel for theology and faith in the crucible of the now. The Psalms were far too doctrinaire, too moralistic, and above all, too dour, too boring, too much lament to serve the evolving needs of the buoyant church of evangelicalism. The ascendancy of the Western church, I conclude, has crested. Evangelical triumphalism is gasping its last. We're living in a post-Christian era, right? We desperately need the Psalms to navigate the dark days ahead, not select Psalms, excerpts from the Psalms, or gospelized resignifications of the Psalms, but the whole Psalter as it stands written. Because when our aggrieved souls can no longer articulate our desperate need for God's manifold providence and grace, we need to have something to sing. Okay, I believe I've left you here, well, 3 minutes, but I started late, so you can take a little bit longer if you need to ask a few questions. I know it's not much time, but
all right, I saw we already have some questions popping in Zoom. Let's see here. Jordan says, I would love to hear more about Dr. Snoeberger's claim that Second Temple Judaism would not have had a concept of using songs to encourage faith alongside the sermon. Jordan's working on the Lucan Canticles, and part of that is based on Second Temple Jewish roots of congregational song.
I guess I mean, that sort of puts a few words into my mouth here that I'm not sure I had there, but
feel free to pop in too. You can unmute.
Yeah, and I'm having to paraphrase. I don't have the written copy, so I don't mean to misquote you,
right?
But that's the gist of it, coming from, I believe, right around the Keach section.
Mm-hmm. I'm not doubting that there is in the early church original hymnody, and even before that, the Jews were composing original songs. I don't know if I want to call them hymns, but particularly in the early church, and that's mostly what I'm concerned about. There seems to be a real caution that we not introduce. In fact, oftentimes the language is used, uninspired hymns. We should prefer inspired hymns, stuff that's drawn directly from the scriptures, and hold at some arm's length and perhaps preserve for private usage the original hymnody of the day.
So you're arguing for a both and, not an either or.
There is a both and, but perhaps a greater caution than sometimes is suggested.
Yeah, good. Other questions, thoughts from the presentation? Yes.
I was just wondering, what are the parameters, I guess, for a song to be considered a hymn?
For a song to be considered a hymn? So the question is, what are the parameters for a song to be considered a hymn? How would you differentiate? And it's interesting you use that word unmodified psalmody. So when does a psalm become modified into a paraphrase? When does that become a hymn? How would you classify things?
Well, like you, I'm not sure that I'm prepared to give a biblically refined definition of hymns and spiritual songs. I'm not sure I can say that those are separate ideas. There's this. Paul uses these triads routinely in his writing, so I'm not sure that Paul is trying to introduce 3 separate kinds of song: hymns, psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. It may be that that's the case, but the distinctions have really eluded us. To me, I typically use the term hymn to reference songs with theological content, where spiritual songs are more the testimonials. but again, that's just my own sort of predilection there. I don't know if I've got biblical basis for saying that, but yeah, but psalms are very clearly defined. We know what a psalm is, and even though there's modified psalms, I would call them modified psalms. I wouldn't call them hymns at that point until they're original in terms of original compositions.
You have to chant in the original Hebrew for it actually to be a true psalm. Good, maybe time for one more question. Yeah, Caleb.
So as we look at the modern church, where a lot of churches are turning away from using the hymnals every Sunday, which is sad in my opinion, how would we approach singing the Psalms in church? Like, would we use the hymn tunes that our churches know? Like, for instance, like, for All Hail the Power of Jesus saying, if your church only knows coronation, you're not always going to do diadem.
Yeah.
So would you just try to use hymn tunes to those texts for the church?
Good. So the question is, especially in a contemporary context where churches are moving away from using hymnals, what might be some of advice for introducing psalms? Would you recommend trying to marry them with tunes the congregation already knows? Or what might be some ways to help churches sing the psalms again?
Well, I think, yeah, we have a little bit of that doing that in contemporary life, a precious little, but there's some of that going on. Probably the thing that sort of sticks out to me is that the tenor of the Psalms, the mood of the Psalms needs to be preserved. Like we say, about 40% of the Psalms are laments, and our hesitancy to use a lament, I think is perhaps a problem that we have. This is a sort of a truism here, but we sing happy thoughts, happy songs to forget. We sing sad songs to remember, and we're a religion of remembering and recollecting and reflecting on truth. And so the idea of lament and serious reflection on the things of God is something that's really lost a lot in the evangelical world. And so introduce them using vernacular tunes, but only ones that are suitable to the message of the Psalms too.
Even when we use the Psalms, we tend to gravitate towards the shepherds and the sheep and the praise and the happy stuff,
right?
Which is just an argument for singing the whole Psalms.
Yes.
And a good plug to take my Psalms class, because we get into this, and we could talk a lot about how we can do this and sing the full Psalms so that we get the full of what God has inspired and really let it form us. So good. Let's thank Dr. Snoeberger once again.